Hi, today we're going to talk about some basic sentence elements and how knowing those elements can help us choose the right pronoun. So let's take a look at some things that you may already know, that every sentence has a subject, and the subject is the person or thing that does the verb, pretty simply. And we also know that every sentence has to have a verb. But what we don't really think about too much is the fact that there are a couple of different types of verbs. We're going to break those down into two distinct categories. There are action verbs, and an action verb is the action that is done by the subject. Okay, so that would be anything like throwing, walking, to talk, to juggle, anything that you would consider an action is an action verb, and that's pretty self-explanatory. But there's another type of a verb also, and you may know it as a linking verb, but I'm going to refer to it as a state of being verb because I think this term state of being is actually a more accurate way to describe this kind of verb. And a state of being verb functions a little bit like an equals sign. So you could say that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or you could say 2 plus 2 is 4. And is one of our state of being verbs. There are only 8 of those. Is, are, was, were, am, be, been, and being. But there's also several different forms. Anything with the word be in it, like could be, should be, would be, might have been, could have been, should have been, anything with these words in them are going to be state of being verbs. And we're going to talk about how those work in just a little bit. And then things get a little bit complicated, though, when we get into things like direct objects. So I'll give you a definition of the direct object. The direct object receives the action of the verb. And we'll apply that to some of these examples and talk about what that means. Now we're going to get into a couple of terms that you may never have heard of, and those are predicate nominative and predicate adjective. And these sound a little complicated at first, but they're actually not. I'll show you what those mean, and we'll apply those to some sentences. Predicate nominative simply renames the subject, and predicate nominatives work only with state of being verbs. So the trick here to understand is that action verbs go with direct objects. So you're only going to have a direct object if you have an action verb. You're only going to have a predicate nominative or a predicate adjective if you have a state of being verb. So it's important to note what kind of verb we have. So predicate nominative renames the subject. So if you said, Bill is my friend, then Bill is the subject, is the act or the state of being verb, and friend is the renaming of the subject, because Bill is my friend. Is like an equal sign. Bill and friend are the same thing. Bill is not doing anything to his friend. Bill is being the friend. He is the same thing. Okay, predicate adjective works the same way, only it's an adjective that describes the subject, but that adjective comes after the verb. Okay, now that may sound a little complicated, but let's take a look at some of these examples, and we'll apply them to choosing the right pronoun. So let's look at these really simple basic sentences. Dave threw the ball. Okay, so we can probably figure out that Dave is the subject and the verb is threw, and we know that threw is an action verb. It's a past tense action verb, and now we can apply this term. Direct object receives the action of the verb. What did Dave throw? He threw the ball. The direct object is always a noun. So if Dave threw the ball, and Dave is the subject, threw is the action verb, and ball is the direct object, then we have a complete set of facts going on here. All right, now let's take a look at a little bit different situation. Mike is the subject, and is the verb. Now is not an action verb. Is one of these state of being verbs up here. So is going to function quite a bit differently from an action verb. So Mike is not doing anything to my friend. Mike equals my friend. Friend is not a direct object, but a predicate nominative because it renames the subject. So friend and Mike are the same thing. The is like an equal sign. Mike equals friend. And the interesting thing about Mike is my friend and other sentences with state of being verbs is the fact that you can flip those around. You could say my friend is Mike, Mike is my friend, and it means exactly the same thing, just like an equal sign. So 2 plus 2 equals 4 is the same as 4 equals 2 plus 2. Works just like a math equation. All right, let's take a look at the next example. Shania is the subject, and walked is the verb. You can probably figure that part out. Is walked an action verb or a state of being verb? Well, in this case, walked is an action verb. It doesn't fit any of those, so it's going to be an action verb. And we have a lot of action verbs, many action verbs, only a few state of being verbs. Shania is not the same thing as her dog, but she is taking an action, and the dog is receiving that action. Who's receiving the walk? The dog is. So the dog is a direct object. Let's take a look at the next one. Darla is the subject. Was is a state of being verb. It fits right up here in this category. And now happy is not a predicate nominative, but a predicate adjective, because happy describes Darla, but it comes after the verb. So Darla was happy. It's not just a simple adjective saying, like we would normally see with an adjective coming right before the noun, but it comes after the verb. So Darla was happy, subject, state of being verb, and predicate adjective. Okay, so that's not as complicated as it sounds. Let's take a look at the rest of the examples then. The cat is the subject. The verb is chased. We know that chased is an action verb. And what did the cat chase? The cat chased the mouse. So we know that the mouse is a direct object. The mouse is receiving the action of the cat's chasing. All right, the woods are the subject. Were, and what kind of a verb is were? It's not an action verb, it's a state of being verb. Scary. Is scary a noun or is it an adjective? Well, scary is an adjective, and it comes after the state of being verb, and it describes the subject, so it is what we would call the predicate adjective. Let's take a look at the next one. The lady is the subject, and paid is the verb, and this verb is an action verb. It's not a state of being verb. So we know that we're not going to have a predicate adjective or a predicate nominative because they only go with state of being verbs. The lady paid the bill. Paid is an action verb, therefore bill is going to be a direct object, and the direct object receives the action of the paying. This is the person who did the action, this is the action, and this is the receiver of the action. So the direct object is the receiver of the action. The next one says Clayton. We know that Clayton is the subject. The verb is was. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of verb is it? And we know that it is a state of being verb, so it functions like an equal sign. And leader, is that going to be a direct object or is it going to be a predicate nominative? Well, it's a noun, so it has to be a direct object or a predicate nominative. Can't be a predicate adjective. And since was is a state of being verb, then leader is going to be a predicate nominative because it's the same thing as Clayton. Clayton is the leader. Leader and Clayton are the same thing. This renames the subject. All right, is this starting to make sense? Samantha is the subject, and the verb is, and is probably the most basic state of being verb, functions just like an equal sign. Samantha is athletic. Okay, so we know it's going to be a predicate, nominative, or a predicate adjective. Well, is athletic a noun or an adjective? We know that athletic describes Samantha, so it has to be an adjective, and it comes after the state of being verb, so it has to be a predicate adjective. All right, one last example. The captain was eager. The captain is the subject. We have a verb, and we know that was is one of our state of being verbs. And eager, since was is a state of being verb, eager has to be either a predicate nominative or a predicate adjective. Well, if it's a noun, it's going to be a predicate nominative. If it's an adjective, it's going to be a predicate adjective. And eager, we know, describes the captain, so it is a predicate adjective. Again, it's an adjective that comes after the state of being verb, but it describes the subject. All right, now why is that important? Because we're going to move on to another skill here that talks about choosing the correct pronoun. And this is a little bit fun because, a lot of times parents like to tell their kids not to say, me and my friend are going to the mall. And that's true. You shouldn't say that because it's not correct English. So how do you know what to say? Well, your parents are likely to say, my friend and I are going to the mall. Okay, that would be correct. But why is it correct? We could go through all kinds of different complicated formulas to figure that out, or we could take an easy shortcut and just say, leave the other person out. And that gives you, most of the time, gives you your correct answer. So let's see how that works. We cheered the pitcher as the trainer and, would it be he or him, limped off the field? The trainer and, okay, well, let's leave out the trainer. Let's cut that out for a second and just say, we cheered the pitcher. Sorry, I cut out the wrong word. We cheered the pitcher as he limped off the field. So when we leave out the other person, we get our answer. You would never say, we cheered the pitcher as him limped off the field. But for some reason, when we add another person, we get confused and we start using the wrong pronoun. But the trick is to leave the other person out and you have your answer. So let's apply that to the next example. Yoko sat between Dan and, would it be between Dan and I or between Dan and me? Well, between is a preposition. So let's leave Dan out, okay? And we don't want to put the word and in there because we don't have anybody else to add. So Yoko sat between me. Well, you can't really sit between a person. But if we put another preposition there like beside, Yoko sat beside. You wouldn't say Yoko sat beside I. You would say Yoko sat between or beside me. So get rid of Dan, and that gives you your answer. All right, let's take a look then. Instead of Yoko, we have Marcia sitting now. Marcia sat near Fred and, would it be I or me? Well, let's take Fred out of the equation. Marcia sat near me. So it's almost natural that you would pick me if you leave Fred out. And so it's not always the other person and I, like sometimes we're told. In this case, it's the other person and me. So it depends on how you would use, or which pronoun you would use if you left the other person out. That's the easy way to take care of it. Now, here's where it gets complicated. And this is why we did the little exercise we did before. The best singers in the school were Sam and, would it be me or I? Well, let's take Sam out of the equation. And since it's now singular, the best singer in the school, you would say was, would you say was me or was I? You would probably say me. But let's talk about why it's not me. The best singer in the school was I. Well, you probably wouldn't say that, right? I mean, I is the correct answer because this is a state of being verb. Okay, so the best singer was I. You would say I was the best singer. So since this is a state of being verb, it works like an equal sign. And this is the subject form, the singer. And this renames the subject. So it's technically in the subjective case. And that gets a little complicated, but we'll take a look at some other examples and hopefully we can figure that out. Again, you wouldn't say the best singer was I, but you would say I was the best singer. So we might have to go through a few extra steps until we can figure this out. Let's take a look at number 5. Elena and, would it be they or them? Elena and them made up a cheer. Well, let's get rid of Elena to arrive at our answer. They made up a cheer. Okay, now we have an easy answer, right? But that only makes sense when we have action verbs. When we have state of being verbs, it gets a little more complicated. So would you say we creative writers needed a laugh or us creative writers needed a laugh? Well, let's get rid of creative writers. Would you say us needed a laugh? Probably not. You would more than likely say we needed a laugh. So it starts to make a little bit of sense there. Did it sound funny to Jeff and I, or did it sound funny to Jeff and me? Well, we know that sounded is an action verb, so we can use our easy shortcut in this way. Let's get rid of Jeff, and we have our answer. That sounded funny to me. You wouldn't say it sounded funny to I. Okay, let's take a look at number 8. Are you and, would it be her or she, referring to the last game? Well, let's get rid of you. And since it's singular, now we have to change this to is. Would you say is her referring to the last game? Or would you say is she referring to the last game? And most of us would say is she referring to the last game? So you have your answer. Number 9, Glenn and, would it be Glenn and I or Glenn and me? Well, let's get rid of Glenn, and we have our answer. I can think of slogans. You would not say me can think of slogans, but you could certainly hear somebody saying Glenn and me can think of slogans. But if you take Glenn out of the equation, you have your answer. Number 10, how can you help? Would you say we geniuses or us geniuses? Well, let's get rid of the word geniuses, and we have our answer. How can you help us? So the answer would be us geniuses. Number 11 is a little different because we have a state of being verb, was. It was Bob and, would you say me who led the race or I who led the race? Well, let's get rid of Bob. Would you say it was me who led the race or it was I who led the race? Well, in this case, you would say it was I who led the race. But we probably wouldn't say that. Most of us wouldn't use that kind of terminology. We would probably just say I led the race. So it's I because it is the subject, was is a state of being verb, and I is the same thing as it. It renames the subject, and that's what the predicate nominative does. All right, let's take a look at 12. The most loyal fans at our school are Jill and me or Jill and I. Well, okay, the loyal fans, that's the subject. And the verb is are, and we know that are is a state of being verb. So since it's not an action verb, and rather a state of being verb, it's going to get a little bit complicated. So would you say the most loyal fans at our school are, well, let's get rid of Jill. Okay, maybe that'll help. The most loyal fan at our school is me, or would you say I? Well, you would probably say me, but unfortunately, you would be wrong. Because what you would probably say, though, is, I am the most loyal fan at our school. And since that's a state of being verb, since are is a state of being verb, that's why it gets so complicated. But you can say I and most loyal fan, and remember that I is the same thing as the loyal fan. So there are works like an equal sign, so you can flip them back and forth. All right, same thing applies with number 13. Could have been is a state of being verb. So we're going to have to apply what we used before. It is the subject. Could have been is a state of being verb. Let's get rid of Chrissy. And, oh gosh, it could have been Chrissy and me, or it could have been Chrissy and I. Well, since this is a state of being verb, could have been, the answer is going to be I, because I is the same thing as it, rather than being done by it. So it's a predicate nominative. All right, let's take a look then at number 14. This one gets a little bit complicated because it's an action verb, but it's an action verb with a helping verb. So in this case, was is no longer a state of being verb. It's being used as a helping verb. And helping verbs are sometimes called auxiliary verbs. They change the meaning slightly of the verb, but made is an action verb. So anytime you have a helping verb with an action verb, technically the whole thing functions as an action verb. It was made for Billy and, well, let's get rid of Billy, see what happens. Would you say it was made for me, or it was made for I? Well, I think our answer is really clear. It was made for me. Whether Billy's in the picture or not, it was made for me. All right, the teacher chose her and I hear people sometimes saying her and I, which can't be correct because her is in the objective case. It works with direct objects. And I is the subjective case. You only use I in a subjective form. So the teacher chose. Okay, chose is an action verb. Let's get rid of her. Would you say the teacher chose I to do the job, or the teacher chose me to do the job? Well, I think the answer is really clear. The teacher chose me to do the job. So that's a little bit of an introductory level sort of rundown of how we choose the correct pronouns. Most of the time you just use the shortcut. You just leave the other person out. But when you catch yourself in a situation where there's a state of being verb, then it's going to be a little bit different, and you have to get into those complicated formulas that we used before. And I know it sounds a little bit complicated now, but once you get used to it, it'll just become second nature to you, and pretty soon you'll be correcting your parents and your teachers and your brothers and sisters and all those people who used to correct you all the time. So, and hopefully you have fun with that.